Greetings and salutations. I am Elise, and I want to talk about what I think is behind many of the behaviors that leave African American women stuck and repeating destructive patterns. I believe the reason is in our history that is rooted in chattel slavery. Most of the videos that you find about slavery have images that evoke anger, hurt, and outrage. But this is not going to be one of those videos. I want everyone who clicks on this video to stay engaged until the very end, because the message I want you to hear is important. Slavery has been in existence since the beginning of time. You may not know it, but the social, economic, and legal position of slaves were different in various systems of slavery. Until the Atlantic slave trade, most slaves were the group of people on the losing side of a war. It was all about kingdoms, land, and wealth. While the slaves were prisoners of war, they were still considered to be human beings. Some systems of slavery were temporary. The slave worked so many years and was released, or was given a small wage and could eventually buy their own freedom. These systems of slavery or indentured servitude were often familial, as the slaves lived in or nearby the home and were considered a part of the household. But everything changed when the first African slaves arrived in the American colonies in 1619 on the shores of Jamestown, Virginia. Their purpose was to help in the production of tobacco crops. This was the beginning of chattel slavery, also known as traditional slavery in America. The United States of America was founded by colonists that left Europe searching for religious freedom, along with some criminals shipped in by Britain to get them out of the country for good. When they got here, the land that they quote-unquote bought from the Native Americans was very hard to farm with such a small population. The arrival of the African slaves meant cheap labor and the promise of financial wealth. But how could the good Christian settlers justify holding people against their will to get what they wanted? Well, anytime anyone does something that they know is wrong, they have to justify their actions to themselves and to anyone else who is paying attention. Otherwise, they would have to live with the guilt every single day. So the colonists made up in their mind that the Africans were not human like they were. They used dehumanization to relieve their guilt. Dehumanization is a psychological process where one group of people view another group of people as less than human and therefore not worthy of any moral consideration. Dehumanization degrades the target group to the level of work animals and sometimes lower. They are typically viewed as inferior, less intelligent, violent, and criminal on a genetic level by the oppressing group. The slave owners were good Christians that went to church every Sunday while they held African slaves captive against their will. They did everything in their power to break the spirit of the slave, including beating, lynching, rape of men, women, and children. Their verbal abuse proclaimed to the world that African slaves were stupid, that their skin color marked them as inferior, that their hair and facial features were ugly and animal-like. The slave owners knew the power of family, so they regularly broke families apart by selling off family members. They didn't allow the slaves to congregate because they may plot a revolt against the masters. Slaves were not allowed to read or write because the masters knew that knowledge is power, and knowledge could inspire the slaves to demand or forcibly take back their freedom. The slave owners felt justified in their actions because they had to do what was necessary to maintain tight control over the Africans so the plantations and the country could prosper. 1619 was the first year for chattel slavery in America, and it was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1865. That means that the African American slaves legally endured imprisonment, being bought and sold as animals, forced labor, physical violence, sexual violence, and verbal abuse for 246 years. Think about that. The African slaves experienced some form of psychological trauma daily for 246 years. But it didn't end there. The slaves were freed, but there were still many laws put in place that controlled where, when, and how the freed American slaves could live their lives. After 246 years of treating the slaves like animals, do you think that the former slave owners showed remorse? Do you think they apologized? No, they were angry. They had gotten rich off the backs of the slaves, and now they no longer had them to use to work their plantations and farms. They often tricked the newly freed slaves into coming back to the plantation to work for the lowest possible wages, and they still considered the free slaves less than human and treated them as such. At this point in history, killing a black person was legal in some states if a white man or woman that said that that slave had committed a crime. Random violence against the former slaves was still tolerated and sometimes encouraged. Basically, whites could do anything they wanted to the freed slaves, and the black Americans had to endure it with no legal recourse. The freed slaves endured another 99 years of abuse and discrimination until equality was legislated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex. I was 1 year old when this act was ratified. So basically, Africans in America were bought and sold as property, or simply legally considered subhuman for 345 years. 345 years. We have been legally protected for just the past 52. Can you imagine what it takes for a woman to endure the shame and loss of captivity, forced labor, rape, birthing children by men who hate her and men that she hates, watching her family members beaten and killed? Can you imagine the impact on the slave children who witnessed these violent events generation after generation after generation? And when the day came that they were finally free, Imagine the level of disappointment and helplessness that they felt after finding out that their former slave owners could still treat them like dirt and control their lives with no repercussions. As a young girl, I remember watching the movie Roots that was based on the book by Alex Haley. It was hard to watch. The beatings, the violence, and it made me wonder if the combined influence of so many years of violence had created the dysfunctional behaviors that I saw in myself and my family members. So let's look at the four main components of the trauma associated with chattel slavery in America and the effects of those traumatic events on the human psyche. Because I am not a counselor or a mental health professional, when I was thinking about doing this video, I realized that I needed more than my personal opinion to back up my theory on the effects of chattel slavery and dysfunction in Black America today. So I searched because I knew there had to be a scholarly Black person out there who felt the same way I did and would write a dissertation or a book on the subject. And I was right. The book had been written. And the book that I found was Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, PhD. Her book validated my longtime theory and gave me positive examples of culture traits that have been handed down to us by our African ancestors as well. Dr. DeGruy's book examines the horrible conditions of slavery and then breaks down how the legacy of slavery still affects Black Americans today. She explains in this excerpt from the book exactly how it is passed down. The question remains, how are such effects of trauma transmitted through generations? The answer is quite straightforward. How do we learn to raise our children? Almost entirely through our experience of being raised. Most of us raise our children based upon how we ourselves were raised. Of course, there are things our parents did that we decide we'll do differently, but for the most part, parenting is one of a myriad of skills that is passed down generation to generation. What do you think gets passed down through generations if what was experienced were lifetimes of abuse at the hands of slave masters and other authorities? What do you think the result would be if generation after generation of young men were not allowed the power and authority to parent their own children? What do you think the result would be if education was prohibited for generations? What do you think the result would be if the primary skills that mothers teach their children are those associated with adapting to a lifetime of torture? Today we know that if a child has an abusive parent, the likelihood that he or she will grow to be abusive is greater than if that child came from a safe and supportive home. We know that if a child comes from a violent home, there is a greater likelihood the child will grow to be violent. We know that if a child comes from a home in which one or both parents went to college, there is a greater likelihood that the child will go to college. We know that our children receive most of their attitudes, life skills, and approaches to life from their parents. We also know that most of these are learned by the time they are 5 or 6 years old. What training did children in bondage receive? Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an eye-opening book, and I could share about it for hours, but there isn't time for that in this video. So I have provided a link to buy the book and learn more about it in the description box. If you really want to understand the legacy of chattel slavery on African Americans today, you have to read it. And if you have any influence over African American children, you must read this book. To me, the biggest tragedy of this legacy is that both the African slaves and the slave owners and other whites completely embraced the dehumanization lie created by the slave owners. How could they not? The lie was promoted for 345 years, passed down generation after generation, and still is being passed down today. Just as African Americans have a legacy of trauma, Caucasian Americans have a legacy of fear and hate. For 246 years, the slave master taught his children that African slaves were inferior savages to be bought and sold. For another 99 years, white Americans taught their children that blacks were dangerous and not good enough to have in their white spaces. I believe that we were declared dangerous because deep down they knew that all the atrocities they visited upon the slaves was horrific. And they feared that if the tables were ever turned, the descendants of the slaves would imprison them and inflict the same abuse and worse. The trauma of the blacks and the fear of the whites are why race relations in the United States is such a volatile subject. So here we are today. Our ancestors survived the trauma of slavery, and as a people we've come a very long way. But we still bear some scars because of the past as well. What do we do now that we know why? We could use our energy to complain about the atrocities our ancestors endured. We could rail against the oppression of 2016. We can lose hope for our future because it seems that the odds are against us and decide to do absolutely nothing. Or maybe we will be able to acknowledge the strength of the women who came before us and decide that we will no longer accept the lies that were told to us not so very long ago. Yes, we do face systemic racism that is so deeply ingrained in American culture that most white Americans will tell you that it doesn't exist. But what if we determine that we will learn the system, that we will understand every loophole, and that we will work that system to our advantage like a full-time job? In every area of life, we cannot change what we will not acknowledge. Ladies, we do have residual battle scars from chattel slavery that shape the way we view ourselves and the way we move through this world, and it has caused challenges. But now is the time to make a decision. Will you take in this information and let the scars take you out? or will you decide that it is time to fly? Emotional health, wholeness, education, travel, and healthy relationships can be yours if you decide you want it bad enough. My question to you is, do you want it bad enough? If you do, then come on, let's go. Next week, I'm going to introduce the Black Butterfly #1 rule for flying. Love yourself first. Join me to learn about the power and necessity of self-love for success. All you'll need is an open mind, a spiral-bound notebook, and a good pen. I am Elise, the Black Butterfly. Thank you for watching. And if you like what you've heard, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Until next week, peace and blessings.